Hiya Seven, welcome to this video on the boy in striped pyjamas. Today we're looking at chapter 20, which is the final chapter in the text. So let's start with a summary then. So Bruno is never heard from again. Soldiers search every part of the house and the village, and his clothes are found at the fence. But it seems as if he has vanished off the face of the earth. Mother stays in Outwith for some time, hoping Bruno will turn up. When she does return to Berlin, Gretel notices that Mother spends most of her time crying. And Gretel too misses Bruno very much. Father stays at Outwith for a year, but orders around the soldiers mercilessly and becomes very disliked. So one day, Father forms a theory about what happened to Bruno. He goes to the part of the fence where Bruno's clothing was found, and when Father puts all the facts and his theories together, he collapses from the weight of his realisation. A few months later, different kinds of soldiers come to Outwith and order Father to go with them. Still distraught from his realisation as to what happened to Bruno, Father goes happily as he no longer cares what happens to him anymore. The narrator states that this is the end of the story of Bruno and his family. Of course, the narrator says, all this happened a long time ago, and nothing like that could ever happen again. Not in this day and age. Very interesting end to this story, and that's something that we're going to analyse in a little while. So let's have a look at an analysis. Okay, so Bruno dies anonymously, along with the other victims of the concentration camp. As these victims' bodies were either left in mass graves or burned, and Bruno was wearing the striped pyjamas of the other prisoners, his body is never identified as different from the rest. So this is actually a metaphor. So this is another metaphor for how, despite all the Nazis' anti-Semitic rhetoric, there is truly no difference between human lives, regardless of race or religion. Strangely, Boyne's narrator continues to speak as if through Bruno's perspective even after Bruno's death. Auschwitz is still out with, and Mother and Father are still referred to as such. So let's have a look at these Nazi propaganda posters. If your green and yellow flight path, can you define the term anti-Semitism for me and decide what we can infer from these images? What do you think the message is trying to convey? And if you're bronze and red, I'd like you to analyse this metaphor that's discussed above in a little bit more detail, and then link this metaphor to these images. How do they link? Is it possible to link them? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So let's move on to some more analysis. So the narrator continues in Bruno's voice of purposeful innocence and naivety. So the different soldiers are never specifically named as the Allies. All of Boyne's vague language regarding the Holocaust is an attempt to make his fable universal, and this point is especially emphasised in the bitingly ironic last lines of the book. Ironic, of course, because atrocities are taking place at any given time somewhere in the world, and people seem to have learned few lessons from the Holocaust. So this is, Boyne wants this to be universal. He wants everyone to be able to feel empathy towards what's going on, to be able to relate in some way or another to this text, even though we haven't necessarily witnessed the Holocaust or been a part of the Holocaust, yet we are still able to empathise with what's going on. So, for example, when we say vague language, we mean we're not going, the book doesn't use very specific terminology associated to the Holocaust. jargon associated to the Holocaust. He's trying to keep it as accessible as possible to his reader so that anyone around the world who is reading this can empathise with it. Okay, so therefore the lessons of this book, the dangers of nationalism, racism, sexism, complacency and ignorance, are meant to be applied to present situations so as to keep history from repeating itself. Within the narrative itself, we are given few details of the nature of Father's moment of realisation. It's unclear if Bruno's death made Father realise that his thousands of other victims were valuable humans as well, or if he was simply overcome with emotion and essentially lost his sanity. Father's punishment is never stated in the book, but he was likely tried at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death for his war crimes. So, if you're green and yellow, can you define nationalism for me? What are the strengths and weaknesses of nationalism? Bronze and red, I want us to look into the theory that history repeats itself a little bit more. So it's discussed above and it's associated to the metaphor on the previous slide. But I want us to research an example of when this has happened before. Why don't we ever learn? Why does history repeat itself? I've also given you this quote, "The picture never changes, only the frame around it," which you might like to infer something from. And then I've given you a link. I've given you a YouTube link to try and explain to you a little further of what we mean by history repeats itself. Okie dokie. So now we can move on to our flight paths. I've given you a new meme today, so I hope that makes you laugh a bit. It did me. So green. Discuss the theme of nationalism in the text using a PEE paragraph structure. So if you'd already done the task on the previous slide, then you should already know what nationalism is. So we're just going to put that into a point, evidence, explain paragraph structure. If you're yellow, I want you to watch this clip and evaluate Holocaust denial theory. What is a denier? What does Lipstadt discuss? And what does she conclude? Bronze, I want you to watch this TED talk on why are we so obsessed with World War II. The historian Keith Lowe discusses this huge subject in a very concise and meaningful manner. I want you to summarise his argument, and do you have any questions for him? The links to all of these, by the way, are on the assignment page, so you won't be able to click them here, but they are on the assignment page as well. And finally, red. Red, Boyne uses the tool of dramatic irony. Can you remember when we did dramatic irony back in September when we were looking at Romeo and Juliet? That might help you. Throughout the story, how does it manifest in the final chapters of the novel? Remember, piece chain, point to evidence, analysis, context, and effect on the reader. Okay, and finally, obviously we've now finished the end of the book. Of course, if you haven't read chapter 20, make sure you do so. How do you feel about the ending of the book? What emotions have you felt? And what is the most important thing you have learnt from the book as a whole? Okay, I'm going to leave you with that. If you've got any questions, just let me know. Thanks for listening.